Welcome back. So in this module for 303, we will talk about three things: Azure Resource Group, Management Group, and Subscription Limit. So let's talk about what is Resource Group. So before I talk about that, let me jump into the Azure portal. And if I go into my Azure portal, what I can do, I can just create a resource group. So if I go ahead and say create a resource group, the experience would be fairly simple. So click on add, give a name, let's say RGAZ303, and then choose the location. So it can be anywhere within the Azure locations available to you. So if I go ahead and say create the resource group, it goes ahead and creates the resource group. Now you need to remember that this is a logical container for the resources you create. So resources are generally within the resource group. And once you create a resource group, it doesn't hold back anything, hence you are not charged for it, right? It's a logical container. The resources are deployed within it. Resources like virtual machines, like application gateways, like Cosmos DB. So anything you can think of which you need for your application should stay within the resource group. Uh, Resources must be in a resource group, and resources can only be a member of a single resource group at a time. So one resource cannot be a member of two resource groups. You need to also identify that. Many resources can be moved between resource groups. So if you create, let's say, resources to this resource group, and if later point in time you want to move it to another resource group, you can do that, but with some limitations. So you need to identify those limitations. Uh, Resource groups cannot be nested. So you cannot create a resource group within a resource group, right? So unlike folder and subfolder, you cannot do that, right? So if you create a resource group, then all the resources within that resource group will be deleted. If you delete the resource group, all the resources within that resource group will be deleted, right? So you do not have to go one by one, and that becomes very easy, right? And you can also have a billing consistency. So if you want to really pinpoint and then say what is the cost for this deployment, you go ahead and then identify the resources within that resource group and to identify the cost for it. Now, coming to that management group. So let me show you the visual aspect of the management group. Now, when you create a tenant, right, a root management group gets created by default automatically. So without you really worrying about it, you get a management group created by default. Now you can further drill down and create new management groups within that tenant, but you can just leave it like that. Doesn't really matter. So let's suppose you create a new management group. Then you can create management group within a management group. So it is really hierarchical, unlike resource groups. And you can even create a subscription within a management group. Now, what is the use of management group? So management group together does a lot of things. So it basically manages policies, like for example, in an organization, if you have virtual machines with a naming convention you need to follow along, you can put that policy in the management group, and all the subscriptions created within that management group will inherit that policy for the VM naming convention. So you do not have to really take care the VM naming convention policy in all different subscriptions. That's the benefit, right? So you can basically apply the compliance for all generic compliance for all the subscription. Um, it basically is hierarchical. You can see that you can create a root top level business group, and then you can subdivide the group into different kind of work they are doing. So if you have, let's say, marketing, and if you have application development, if you have database management, if data warehousing, reporting, you can create different management groups and then create subscription within those sub management groups, if I have to say that way, and apply policies, roles, restrictions, rules, etc. So to create a management group, you can just go to this Azure subscription and it's say management group in the search, and you can just say add a new management group. Once you say that, you can just give a name. I can say demo MGMT, and then I say one, and I say AZ-303 management group, and it'll just go ahead and create the management group. So blank management group, and it will inherit whatever the policies defined in the root management group and then bring them into. So if you want to add additional policies into that, so you can either, let's say, add new. So you can see that there's a tenant root group, and under which I have this management group. So if you go into the tenant root group, you get to see this management group, and then you click on that management group, you have this management group created. So you can add things into that, right? You can add, let's say, policies, you can add multiple subscriptions, etc., etc., into that once you have that management group is created, right? And then things will be much easier. If you have to bring in new policy to your company, you can bring in new policy, and then just add it to the management group, and it will be applied to all the different subscription belonging to this management group. One of the things I also wanted to talk about is the limit. Now, because it is cloud, it is definitely has got more capacity, but there are a lot of limits to that. And those limits are specific to your subscription and what we call in Azure as subscription limit, right? So if you go into the subscription limit, so if you search by the term called Azure subscription limit, you get to see this page, which basically talks about Azure subscription service limit, quotas, and constraints. Now, there are two different terms which is being used over here. One is soft limit and another is hard limit. Now, what is this soft limit really means is that the soft limit is that there is a limit defined, and then if you hit that limit, you can reach out to Microsoft support, raise a ticket, and they will increase your quota by some number. That's soft limit. But there are certain limits which cannot be modified or increased, right? That those are hard limits. And hard limits are the limits you have to live with it. You have to plan accordingly. You have to define your deployment strategy and the number of subscription you might need to create, right? So let's see a couple of the general limits, for example, we have here. So if I go to the general limits, we have created an Azure tenant, right? You can only create, let's say, 10,000 management groups in a tenant, right? That's enough number. So if you are not using one single subscription for everything you do in your organization, you will never reach this limit. But if you, let's say, design in such a way that you will always have one subscription for everything you have today, and if you have 100,000 employees in your organization, and then there are thousands of applications, definitely will hit this limit, right? Um, you can have multiple subscription per management group, right? And then you can have up to 6 levels of hierarchy. So we have mentioned that in the management group, you have hierarchical management group availability, but you can only create up to 6 levels, right? So those are the uh, limitations for management group, right? Which is outside of the subscription. Now there are certain subscription level limitations. So the resource group are like containers. Now you can only create 980 resource groups in a subscription. So if you, let's say, have a single subscription, and there are many people creating their own resource groups. After 980, they will hit an error saying that they can't really have they won't be able to create any more new resource groups into the subscription they are logged in currently. So maybe you need to add one more subscription to have new resource groups created, right? So like that, you have different limits. We have got a resource group limit, right, which basically talks about what is specific to resource group. For example, you can actually have 800 resources per resource group per resource type. So if you have a resource group and if you keep creating resources within that resource group, the moment you hit 800, you will be stopped. You will not be able to create any more additional resources within that resource group. Either you have to delete some of the resources from that resource group, or you have to create a new resource group to deploy another set of resources. But remember one thing, though they are containers, they can talk to each other. So for example, if you have an application in a resource group, you can have a database in another resource group and they will be able to talk to each other. It's not a strict boundary. It's not something which will stop you to interact with each other. It's just a grouping for your better management experience, right? So all these different things you can do in the resource group level, you can see that there are different options available, like there are different resources limit available. For example, if you see you have Cosmos DB, which is highly available database, and then you have got how many instances you can create per cluster, which is 1000, and how many clusters per region per subscription, that is 20. So if you need more clusters, then you probably need more subscriptions. So those are the things which you can explore. As and when you decide to use certain services, you should always be coming to this page and reading about the uh, limitations, because it is important for a solution architect before they design the solution to know about the limits. If you are not aware of the limits, you might end up having problem in the production when it is full-fledged deployed for public usage, right? So with this, I want to end the thing here, and I will come back with more module 1 content.